Steve has defined the lobby and made the case that it has a powerful influence on U.S. Middle East policy. I'd like to take the analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest, and I might add, not in Israel's interest either. I will focus on two cases tonight. First, how U.S. support for Israel's policies against the Palestinians in the occupied territories has fueled our terrorism problem. And second, the run-up to the Iraq War and the influence that Israel and the lobby played in that set of events. There are three cases that we talk about in the book that I will not address in my formal presentation, but we can certainly talk about in the Q&A. That's U.S. policy toward Iran, U.S. policy towards Syria, and U.S. policy during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. Let me start with America's terrorism problem. The conventional wisdom among Israel's supporters is that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians has little to do with why the United States is so hated in the Arab and Islamic world, and more importantly, little to do with our terrorism problem. In fact, Israel is said to be a valuable ally in America's fight against terrorism. Indeed, it is said to be the most important ally by far in the Middle East. This received wisdom, however, is wrong. There is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence that shows U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The State Department, for example, set up an advisory group on public diplomacy in Arab and Islamic countries, which reported in 2006 that, quote, citizens in these countries are genuinely distressed at the plight of the Palestinians and at the role they perceive the United States to be playing. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that I am not making the argument that our support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I am simply saying that it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment device for terrorist organizations, and it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab world. The hostility towards the United States generated by Israel's policies in the occupied territories has been recognized by American presidents since 1967, when Israel first conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is why the official policy of every U.S. president since Lyndon Johnson has been to oppose settlement building in the occupied territories. But no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements. Indeed, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. has protected Israel from criticism at the United Nations and given Israel more foreign aid than any other country and given it unconditionally. Of course, the reason why no president can put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements, even though that's official American policy, is the lobby. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It is commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, number one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently, and he only cares now because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events on 9/11 had nothing to do with Israel. And three, Those involved in the attack on 9/11 hate us because of who we are, not because of our Middle East policies. These lines of argument are frequently purveyed by key figures in the lobby. For example, Robert Satloff from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy claims that bin Laden's identification with the Palestinians is, quote, a recent and almost surely opportunistic phenomenon. Alan Dershowitz maintains that, quote, prior to September 11th, Israel was barely on bin Laden's radar screen, end of quote. And Dennis Ross, who also works at the Washington Institute, says that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that this attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians. These claims, however, are simply not true. It is clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinians since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in public statements of his throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist magazine, wrote in a review of 2 books about bin Laden, one which was a compilation of his major speeches. I'm reading now from Rodenbeck's review. Of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches. Regarding the actual attack on 9/11, we now know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major cause of those attacks. It was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that Congress was a target of the attackers because it is the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also reports that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attack because of events involving Israel, even though doing so would have increased the risk of failure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission report says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it describes as the principal architect of the attacks. To quote the Commission report, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. Again, that's from the 9/11 Commission report, and that's a statement on what KSM's motives were. It is hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role that U.S. support for Israel played in the 9/11 attacks. In short, the present relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is helping to fuel America's terrorism problem. Let me now turn to Iraq. It is manifestly clear to most Americans that the Iraq War is one of the greatest strategic blunders in American history. Our argument is that Israel, and especially the lobby, were 2 of the main driving forces behind the decision to invade Iraq. It is hard to imagine that war happening, we argue, in their absence. To start with Israel itself, it was the only country, besides Kuwait, where both the government and a majority of the population favored the war. The Israeli government, to include Prime Minister Sharon, pushed the Bush administration hard to make sure that it did not lose its nerve in the months before the invasion. Other influential Israelis, like former Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu, also implored the United States to take down Saddam. In fact, Israel was pushing so hard for war that Israel's allies in the United States warned Israeli officials to damp down their rhetoric lest it be seen as a war for Israel. I might also note that in 2006, former President Bill Clinton said that every Israeli politician I knew favored a war against Iraq, even if Saddam did not have WMD. The Israeli public was also solidly behind the war, according to a February 2003 poll, that is 1 month before the war started. 77.5% of Israelis said that they wanted the United States to attack Iraq. One sometimes hears the argument, as I'm sure many of you have, that Israel opposed the Iraq war and actually favored attacking Iraq instead. Attacking Iran instead. There is no question that in early 2002, when the Israelis first got wind that the Bush administration was thinking about attacking Iraq, that key Israeli officials went to Washington and made it clear to the Bush administration and others that they thought Iran was the greater enemy and that the Bush administration should focus on Tehran, not on Baghdad. It is important to emphasize, however, that Israel was not opposed to the United States toppling the regimes in Iraq or Syria, two countries that Jerusalem considers mortal enemies. Israel simply wanted the United States to deal with Iran first. But once the Israelis realized that the war party intended to deal with Iran after it finished the job in Iraq, it enthusiastically embraced the idea of invading Iraq. Thus, between early 2002 and March 2003, the Israelis put significant pressure on the Bush administration to make sure that it chose war over diplomacy with regard to Iraq, while reminding Washington along the way at numerous points that it had to make sure that it did Iran after it finished Iraq. I might add that there is no evidence that Israel warned the United States that Iraq would turn into a quagmire. Indeed, the reason the Israelis were confident that the United States would deal with Iran after they finished with Iraq was because the Israelis thought that we were going to encounter a cakewalk in Iraq. Turning now to the lobby, there is no question that the neoconservatives, one of the core constituencies in the lobby, were the main driving force behind that war. But they were supported by key organizations in the lobby, such as AIPAC. Now that the war has gone south, it is common to hear Israel's supporters say that the main organizations in the lobby did not push for war. But that's not true. This point is made clear in a May 2004 editorial written in The Forward, a Jewish weekly newspaper based in New York. I'm going to read to you from the Forward editorial, again, written in May 2004. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored in to the deliberations of the main Jewish groups. One sometimes hears the claim these days that AIPAC took no position on the Iraq war and certainly did not advocate it. This is not true either. First of all, this claim fails the common sense test, as AIPAC usually supports what Israel wants, and Israel certainly wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Second, and more importantly, there is hard evidence that AIPAC lobbied for the war. For example, AIPAC's executive director, this is AIPAC's executive director, not Steve Walt or John Mearsheimer. AIPAC's executive director, Howard Kaur, told the New York Sun in January 2003 that one of AIPAC's successes over the past year was, quote, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq. The neoconservatives, of course, were the main driving force behind the war. They initiated the idea of using force to topple Saddam in 2 letters written to President Clinton in early 1998. Over the next 5 years, and especially after 9/11, they pushed relentlessly for a war against Iraq. No other group or institution in the United States was seriously committed to invading Iraq over that 5-year period. Indeed, there was significant opposition to invading Iraq even after 9/11 within the State Department, the intelligence community, and the uniformed military.
Why is liberal hegemony doomed? Reason number 1, social engineering in foreign countries is an extremely difficult enterprise under the best of circumstances. Indeed, social engineering in one's own country is especially difficult. But the idea that we can go into a foreign country, where most of the people don't speak the language, don't understand the culture, knock off the regime, right, and therefore create a lot of chaos, and then create order out of that chaos, and not just order out of that chaos, but create liberal democracy or even just democracy. This is a pipe dream. And using the U.S. military for that? I spent 10 years of my life in the U.S. military. I went to West Point. The U.S. military, the U.S. Army, these ground forces that we have, they're good at breaking things. They're good at killing people. They're giant killing machines. The idea that you could take the U.S. Army and send it into Iraq and that it is going to be able to do nation building or state building in a sophisticated way, it's not going to happen, I can guarantee you. You want to send him up against Saddam's army in the middle of the desert in 1991, right? You want to do that? That's Bambi versus Godzilla, right? That's what the U.S. Army or the U.S. Marines are good at doing, right? But you start talking about taking the American military, putting it in a place like Vietnam, putting it in a place like Afghanistan, and letting it do social engineering, not going to work, right? But I don't even care if you bring in experts, it's not going to work anyway. And if it does work, it's going to take you a heck of a long time. But there are 3 other reasons it's not going to work. Second is, nationalism is a remarkably powerful force. You've heard me say that on more than one occasion between the last lecture and this one. And it causes the target state to resist foreign intervention. I won't go into a long song and dance about what nationalism is all about. I'd love to do that. But let me just say, self-determination and sovereignty are at the heart of nationalism. Right? The people in a nation state, the nation itself and the leaders who run a state, they want to determine for themselves what their domestic politics look like, and they want to determine for themselves what their foreign policy looks like. This is what sovereignty is all about. And they don't want a foreign country, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan, or Britain going into Afghanistan, or France going into Vietnam. These people don't want foreigners running their politics. They don't want foreigners occupying their country. And who can blame them? As I point out here, think about the U.S. outrage over claims that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election. Apparently, from reading the newspapers, this drives Americans crazy. The idea that the Russians interfered in our elections. Well, we interfere in elections all over the planet. We interfere in the politics of states all over the planet. We think we have a God-given right to go into any country, violate sovereignty, if it's done for just purposes, which means promoting liberal democracy. We have a rich history of it, as you know. But as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're jealous gods when it comes to our sovereignty, don't you think that people in other countries are going to feel the same way? Don't you think the Vietnamese, after World War II, are going to want the French out? And then when the Americans replace the French, don't you think they're going to want us out? They are. You think the Afghanis are happy about us being there? You think that this is a long-term solution? Of course, you may believe we can do the necessary social engineering to fix the problem. Getting back to my first point, don't bet on it. You understand that Afghanistan is the longest war in American history, and we have now spent quite a bit more money on fixing Afghanistan than we spent with the Marshall Plan. And look at the results. Not pretty. Reason number 3, individual rights. This whole concept of inalienable rights are oversold. If you sort of look around the world at surveys and you look at a number of historical cases, what you see is that people generally think rights are important, but they don't privilege them to the extent that the theory says they should. And people will often sacrifice rights for stability. There's a lot of survey data that shows that this is true today in the Middle East. Hardly surprising. If you lived in one of those countries that the United States has helped wreck, would you be interested first and foremost in creating liberal democracy, or would you be interested first and foremost in creating some stability? I think the answer is quite clear. Go to Russia today. Right? First time I ever went to Russia, I talked to all sorts of people about this issue. How do you think about liberal democracy? Liberal democracy means one thing to them, the 1990s. Tried that, been there, and it was a total disaster. Thank God we have Putin. If he's not a liberal Democrat and he is a semi-authoritarian leader, more power to him. That's the answer you hear most of the time. Can you blame them? But what this means is that liberal democracy is not always an easy sell. It's not like you're going abroad and everybody's out there just demanding liberal democracy. Oh my God, this is the most important political system in the world, and if we can just get it, we'll live happily ever after. This is not to say that there aren't many places where they would prefer liberal democracy over some semi-authoritarian system. There are cases like that. But the point is, it's not an easy sell. And then finally, some states actually act to balance against the unipole. They act according to realist logic. This certainly has been true with China and Russia, and also with Iran and North Korea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about NATO expansion in a second. The Russians view NATO expansion from a purely realpolitik point of view. Right? This is balanced power politics. The idea that the United States can take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union and march it up to Russia's doorstep and make Ukraine and Georgia part of the West, it is not going to happen. They'll tell you that. It is not going to happen for balanced power reasons. And all you have to do is talk about the Chinese, about the presence of the American military in East Asia. It bothers them greatly. They do not like the idea of us being on their doorstep. And they'll tell you behind closed doors they intend to push us eventually out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. And I don't blame them one bit. But I'm just telling you, if you're interested in selling liberal hegemony to major powers in the system like Russia and China, you ought to understand that there are real limits to what you can do. And then, of course, you have minor powers like Iran and North Korea. Look at what North Korea is doing today. People say, oh, what North Korea is doing today is crazy. They're irrational. Kim Jong-un, we've never seen anybody this crazy. The thought of him having nuclear weapons is horrifying. I'd make a case that what Kim Jong-un is doing is very reasonable. If I were Kim Jong-un, I'd have nuclear weapons and I'd never, ever get rid of them. Never. Why? Because the United States is running around the world knocking off regimes. That's what liberal hegemony is all about. That means if you're not a liberal hegemonic state, think about what Michael Doyle said, you could be in the crosshairs. And how do you prevent regime change? The best way to do it is have nuclear weapons. We don't like that for understandable reasons, but from their point of view, it makes eminently good sense. Iran, I've said in public on a number of occasions, if I was the Iranian National Security Advisor, they'd already have nuclear weapons. And I can guarantee you that if they had nuclear weapons, the Americans and the Israelis would not be threatening them. Very simple. But the point that I'm trying to make to you here is that some states resist. Not all of them, but some. Some are foolish, like Colonel Gaddafi. We promised Colonel Gaddafi that if he gave up his WMD programs, we'd leave him alone. You know where he is now. He's 6 feet under. Right? 6 feet under. Very foolish. Bottom line here. Bottom line here is, if you can balance, balance. And some figure that out. So anyway, now, my argument is that with the passage of time, progressive liberalism has trumped modus vivendi liberalism or classical liberalism. Not at the rhetorical level, but in practice. And let me just say a little bit about this. We have in the United States a remarkably powerful state that intervenes in almost all aspects of our life. It's involved in heavy-duty social engineering. And there's no way you can get around that. And the Republicans, just to talk about this in some detail, the Republicans constantly talk about how terrible this is and how they want to change things and how when they get elected, we're going to let the market do this and we're going to stop the government from doing that. We're going to get out of the business of doing social engineering. But if you look at how Republicans behave in contrast to Democrats, there's hardly any difference at all. There's no evidence that Democrats spend more money on social engineering than Republicans do. There's no evidence that Democrats create more institutions than Republicans do. The Republicans created the Department of Homeland Security. The Republicans created the Environmental Protection Agency. Ronald Reagan spent one heck of a lot more money on social issues than Barack Obama did. And even in cases where Democrats outspent Republicans, you look at different presidents, it's by tiny margins. So there's just not much difference at all. There is one political party in the United States that actually truly believes in modus vivendi liberalism. It's represented by the Libertarian Party. The Libertarians are classical liberals or modus vivendi liberals. No single libertarian has ever been elected to Congress. And in the 2016 presidential election, the Libertarian received a little over 3% of the vote. So the idea that we have a political party that really represents modus vivendi liberalism and stands a chance of winning is erroneous. It's impossible. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, despite all the rhetoric, are deeply committed to progressive liberalism. That's to say they're deeply committed to social engineering and they're deeply committed to positive rights. You can make the argument that the Democratic Party is more committed than the Republican Party to positive rights, maybe so. But the Republican Party is also committed to positive rights. Now, why is this the case? It really all began, at least in the United States, in the late 1800s, and it's a function of three things. One is the Industrial Revolution, two is nationalism, and three is these huge wars that we fight. Just on the Industrial Revolution, what happened when the United States really was hit hard with the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th, early 20th century is you had these huge industrial enterprises that came online that did certain things that had huge consequences for people all over the United States and indeed for people all over the planet. And it became very obvious to politicians at the time, and here we're talking about Republicans, because you understand that the original progressives in the United States were not Democrats, they were mainly Republicans. Herbert Hoover was a social engineer par excellence. Teddy Roosevelt was a social engineer par excellence, right? And the reason was that you had to manage this economy. You had to manage these huge industries and figure out rules and regulations. You had all sorts of labor unions, labor problems, child labor problems, and so forth and so on that had to be managed by the state. There's no way you could avoid that. And then, of course, when you start fighting wars, whether it's the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, the state gets involved not only in running those wars, but when the wars are over with, you have to do all sorts of social engineering to reward the people who fought the wars. You remember the GI Bill? The GI Bill is a perfect example of a positive right. It's social engineering. I could go on and on about this, right? And then there's nationalism, of course, which I'll talk much more about next time, right? When you start thinking about nationalism, what happens is that the state has all sorts of reasons to want to organize people down below. For administrative reasons, for economic reasons, for military reasons. The state gets in the business of doing social engineering in a big way, right? When you think about nationalism, the state is interested in creating a coherent nation, and it wants that nation to be loyal to the state. That involves doing all sorts of things of an administrative nature, again, of an economic nature, and a military nature. And of course, with nationalism, people in the nation have a certain loyalty to the state. This is the nation state. The nation has loyalty to the state. And the end result of that is that the state is expected to do things for the nation, for the people. And of course, if you're in a liberal democracy like the United States, politicians who promise to do all sorts of things for people tend to get elected over those who promise not to do big things for people. So in a liberal nation state like the United States that undergoes the Industrial Revolution and then fights big wars, for all those reasons, you move into a world where progressive liberalism dominates. And again, progressive liberalism is all about positive rights, and it's about social engineering. So here's the modern liberal template. Core assumptions: individualism, no universal agreement on first principles. Okay, those were the two starting assumptions I had about human nature. Second, progressive liberalism has triumphed, and with progressive liberalism, you get negative and positive inalienable rights. Those are inalienable rights, those positive rights as well as those negative rights. You get tolerance, and you get a state that engages in social engineering. That's the basic liberal story. Now, how does this apply to IR? Just to get ahead of myself. There are two very important dimensions to this story. One, I've already emphasized, and that's the individualism, right? It's the individualism and the inalienable rights that creates the universalist dimension. Cannot underestimate the importance of this. Liberals, and this is certainly true in countries like the United States and Britain, tend to see people who live in other countries as having the same rights as them. And because they place such a high premium on rights, liberalism is all about rights, really matter. When the rights of those people are being violated in a serious way, needless to say, it's going to create a very powerful incentive to see if you can fix that problem. And if you're the United States of America and you are super powerful, it's not surprising that you're going to be at least tempted to fix the problem, right? So again, that focus on individualism is so important, right? Married to inalienable rights. The second thing that really matters for the international relations dimension of my story is the social engineering. Once you accept the fact that progressive liberalism has triumphed and that we live in a world where liberals are committed to social engineering. And by the way, even if you weren't a liberal, you'd have to be committed to social engineering, just given the complexities of the modern world. Whether it's a liberal state or not, it's going to be an interventionist state at home. But this liberal state, called the United States, is heavily into social engineering. But if you're into social engineering at home, it doesn't take long before you think you can do social engineering abroad. I remember the Iraq War, which I adamantly and publicly opposed before it happened. And I would say to people, do you seriously believe that you're going to go into Iraq and do social engineering? in a country that you really don't understand. We can't even do social engineering at home, much less in a foreign country. But I'll tell you, those boys and girls who took us in, they were very confident that they could do social engineering. They're Americans. These were skill thinkers. These were people who knew how to do business, right? So we went traipsing into Iraq. And of course, you know what happened, which is what I'll talk about next time. In a unipolar system where there is a single great power, this is the United States, of course, when the Cold War ends, you can pursue liberal hegemony because you don't have to worry about the balance of power, because there is effectively no balance of power. You are Godzilla, and you are free to do pretty much what you want. And you understand what's happening here. If you're Godzilla and you have this liberal impulse hardwired into you, you know what you're going to do. You're going to try and create democracy all over the world. I'll say more about that in a second. But unipolarity is where you get liberal hegemony. And as I said, this is consistent with the liberal formula for dealing with conflict. Remember what I said last time. Liberalism at its root is a theory of conflict. Liberals assume that you have individuals, and those individuals cannot agree on first principles in all cases. And sometimes the disagreement over first principles is so powerful that people want to kill each other. And that is why you need the night watchman state. There's no liberal theorist who says you don't need a state. The three-part solution or formula for preventing conflict is, number one, inalienable rights. If everybody has rights and everybody has the right to life, not going to be a lot of killing if you can convince people of that. Furthermore, there's going to be a lot of tolerance. So purveying the norm of tolerance is very important in the liberal story. But all liberals understand that emphasizing rights and emphasizing tolerance, those two things together, is not enough. You need a night watchman state. Think about the state of nature. Liberals start in the state of nature where individuals are constantly in a situation where there's potential for conflict and death. And what they do is they form a social contract. And the social contract involves a higher authority. So you need that higher authority. There's no higher authority in international politics. There is no world state. There's no social contract, despite all this talk about community. Therefore, if you're surrounded by other great powers, you have no choice but to compete with them, according to liberal logic. Because according to liberal logic, without the night watchman state, you are back in the state of nature. The state of nature is anarchic. It's not hierarchic. The reason you form a state, a social contract, is to get out of anarchy. But you don't have that in international politics. And for that reason, when there are other great powers in the system, you have to compete with them, and you can't pursue liberal hegemony. But if you're in unipolarity, the imbalance is so great between Godzilla and all of the minions that Godzilla is free to pursue liberal hegemony. Right, that's the basic argument. Take this one step further. Bruno Montero, as you know, has written the seminal book on unipolarity. And he says in that book that the unipole has three options. If you think about it, these make perfect sense. First of all, the unipole can go home because it's so powerful and secure that it doesn't have to sweat what's going on in the rest of the world. You just go home. You won. We won the Cold War. We're Godzilla. Let's go home. Who's going to threaten us? And if the minions want to fight among themselves, who cares? That's one possibility. Second is you can stay involved abroad and use the power you have to maintain the status quo. Or number three, you can stay involved abroad and use that power to do social engineering on a grand scale. That, number three, is what Uncle Sam did. Because Uncle Sam has this liberal impulse hardwired into it. And it, of course, has the capability in terms of raw power. And as I pointed out to you last time, social engineering is at the heart of modern liberalism. Modern liberalism is all about social engineering. And modern liberals have great confidence in social engineering. So when you put the distribution of power, this liberal DNA, which involves this universalist impulse and your belief in social engineering, you're off to the races. And that's exactly what happened after 1989. Talk a little bit about liberal hegemony in action. You get, as I just said, you get a super ambitious foreign policy. You also get a heavily militarized foreign policy. The United States is a militaristic state. Right? It's really quite remarkable. I'll talk more about this as we go along. We're addicted to war. And these are liberal-driven wars. I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow. Me and my realist friends have been against almost every one of these wars. And it's my liberal friends who are pushing these wars. I have some liberal friends who have never seen a war they didn't want to fight. We have a highly militarized foreign policy. The United States has fought 7 separate wars since the Cold War ended, and it's been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. This is remarkable. Going back to Nuno's template, I thought we won the Cold War. We could go home and relax. We're so powerful. But no. That's not what we did. And we did it for liberal reasons.
Should we go back to sphere of influences and not mingle with other countries?
Did everybody hear his question? His view is basically that I have a more or less reactionary view, and that what I'm talking about in defending the Russians is basically arguing that we should go back to a sphere of influence's view of the world. And I interpret, and I don't think you would have any trouble with this, I interpret a sphere of influence's type of the world to be basic balance of power politics, right? They go together, right? Now, I believe that you can't go back to balance of power politics because we never left them behind, right? This is what we forgot when we moved NATO eastward. Balance of power politics was alive and well. Not in the United States, but in Russia. And it's true in China, and it's true in Iran, and it's true in South Korea, right? So the idea that this is old think, I mean, I think this is the way most Americans think. Your view is what I would call today the sort of typical American view of international politics. We have transcended spheres of influence, right? We live in a different world. And I don't believe that for 1 second. I believe balance of power politics is alive and well. And this is why we got ourselves in so much trouble on Russia. Now, I just want to unpack this a bit more. Talk about the rise of China, okay? If China continues to rise and Russia continues to come back from the dead, we move from unipolarity to multipolarity, or if you want to excise the Russians and just talk about the Chinese and the Americans, you move back to bipolarity, okay? Now remember what I said in the presentation. If you're in a bipolar world or you're in a multipolar world, you cannot pursue liberal hegemony, right? So my argument is that if China continues to rise, the United States will engage in an intense security competition with China, where balance of power politics and spheres of influence matter greatly. And if you go to China today and you talk to the Chinese about the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and you talk about the American military presence in those areas, they do not like it because they view those areas as their sphere of influence. They understand that we got in there when China was weak, but they'd like to get us out. And I would argue that what you'll see with the United States is that the United States will think in terms of spheres of influence. You know what the Monroe Doctrine is, right? The Monroe Doctrine basically says that the United States owns the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power, be it from Europe or be it from Asia, is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere and form a military alliance with a country in our hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, which has not gone away, right? The Monroe Doctrine is all about spheres of influence. It says the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence. Do you think in 25 years, if China decides to form a military alliance with Canada or Mexico and station a couple Chinese divisions in Vancouver and Toronto, that we're not going to go ballistic? You're a young guy, so you probably don't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unfortunately, I'm not a young guy, and I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea that the Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba was completely antithetical to us. And then when they talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos, we almost blew another gasket. The Soviets are not allowed in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because it's an American sphere of influence. Why? Because it's our backyard. Well, if you're Vladimir Putin or any Russian leader, the idea that NATO is going to be allowed to drive right up to your border, it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And you know, people will say, well, John, don't you understand that the Ukrainians are free to choose their own foreign policy? You often hear this argument. We were talking about this yesterday. The Ukrainians are free to choose their own foreign policy. They're a sovereign state. This is not a decision the Russians can make for them. My view is that's a very dangerous way of thinking about international politics. Ukraine is not a sovereign state when it comes to this issue. The Russians are not going to tolerate them forming an alliance with NATO, right? And if Ukraine behaves like it is a sovereign state, right, it's going to get itself into a whale of a lot of trouble. This is what happened to Castro. Do you think the United States believed during the Cold War, and even after the Cold War, that Cuba had the right as a sovereign state to form an alliance with any state that it chose to? We didn't think that for 1 second. We did not think that for 1 second. And we went to great lengths to kill Castro and to strangle Cuba because Castro thought that he, like the Ukrainians thought, had the right to form an alliance with just any state. When you're dealing with great powers, and this is another lecture, great powers are ruthless. The United States is one of the most ruthless great powers in modern history. You cannot underestimate how ruthless the United States is. This is all covered up in the textbooks and the classes that we take growing up, right? Because this is all part of nationalism. Nationalism is all about creating myths about how wonderful your country is, right? It's America, right or wrong. We never do anything wrong, right? If you really look carefully at how the United States has operated over time, it's really amazing how ruthless we have been. And the British, the same is true of them as well. But we cover it up. So I'm just saying, if you're Ukraine and you're living next to a powerful state like Russia, or you're Cuba and you're living next to a very powerful state like the United States, you should be very, very careful. Because this is like sleeping in bed with an elephant. If that elephant rolls over on top of you, you're dead, right? So you got to be very careful. Am I happy about the fact that this is the way the world works? No, I'm not. But it is the way the world works, for better or for worse. Now what I want to do is talk about the United States of America from 1783 to the present. And the argument I want to make is if you look at how we have behaved over time, we have behaved according to the dictates of my theory. None of you have been educated to think this way because you grow up in liberal America where we tell ourselves all these false tales about our history, where we're portrayed as noble people who do nothing but good on the world stage and so forth. So that's not the way it's operated over time. Let's go back to 1783. In the beginning, the United States was comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. What happened over the next 70 or so years is that the United States marched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific Ocean. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico and stole from them what is the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 for the express purpose of incorporating Canada into the United States. The British and the Canadians worried throughout the 19th century that we were going to pay them a return visit because they knew that we had a voracious appetite. Much of the Caribbean would today be American were it not for the slavery issue. The southern states were desperate to expand into the Caribbean to make all sorts of territory in that part of the world, part of the United States of America. And what prevented it was the northern states did not want any more slaveholding states in the Union. As you well know, sugar was the main industry in the Caribbean, and sugar was a labor-intensive industry. That meant there were huge numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, and the northern states did not want more slave-holding states. So not only did we have our gun sights on the Pacific Ocean, we also had our gun sights to the north on Canada, and we had our gun sights to the south. There's no country in modern history that has a record of expansion that comes close to ours. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for the next few months he talked frequently about doing in the Soviet Union what the United States did in North America. That's how the United States was created. A very powerful state, very aggressive state. Second thing we had to do to establish hegemony in this hemisphere is we had to get the European empires out. You all remember President James Monroe in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, he basically told the European great powers, this is our hemisphere. We're eventually going to throw you out. We're not powerful enough to do it, but you're leaving. It's just a matter of when. And once you leave, you are not welcome back here. Again, there are enough of us in this audience to remember the Cold War. You remember how we used to go ballistic when the Soviets would do certain things in places like Cuba? Talk about putting missiles in Cuba, troops in Cuba, building a naval base at Cienfuegos. This was not acceptable to us. This was our hemisphere. We were bent on establishing regional hegemony. So my point is that by 1900, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the United States had established regional hegemony. And as I said before, this is the only regional hegemon in modern history. Now, you have two goals. One is to establish regional hegemony, and two is to make sure there's no peer competitor. What happened in the 20th century? There were four potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States had no intention of allowing any of those countries to dominate Europe, Asia, or in the case of the Soviet Union, Eurasia. We entered World War I in April 1917, when it looked like the Germans might win that war, and we helped finish off the Germans. If I had an extra hour, I could give you my lecture on how I think the United States played the critical role in tipping the balance in favor of the French and British against the Germans. In World War II, we defeated Japan almost single-handedly, and we played a key role, although the Soviets played the key role, in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe. And of course, during the Cold War, we played the principal role in containing the Soviet Union, and then we helped usher it down the toilet bowl when the Cold War ended. And we were glad to see it go. And after it ended, we made it clear to the rest of the world that we had no intention of giving up American primacy. So the United States has a very clear record of not tolerating peer competitors. And we've actually been quite explicit about that. So the argument I'm making to you is if you look at the basic theory that I laid out, and you look at how the United States has really behaved since 1783, it fits very neatly with the theory. This brings me to the third part of the talk, which has to do with China. And of course, my argument is that China will imitate the United States. Now, let's just talk about maximizing relative power. Don't you think the Chinese, given their history over the past 150 years, understand the importance of really being powerful? You know what happened to the Chinese when they were weak? It was really quite terrible. They refer to it as the century of national humiliation. They had the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Americans with their open door policy, exploiting them left and right, occupying them, killing large numbers of people. You go to Beijing, you ask any person this simple question. You have two choices. You can be 10 times more powerful than Japan, or Japan can be 10 times more powerful than you. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese are going to say? The Chinese are going to tell you it is very important to be very powerful. We understand what happened in the past when we were weak. So they will go to great lengths to maximize their relative power. They will want to make sure that the power gap between them and Russia, them and Japan, them and India is as wide as possible. Just like we're very content with the fact that Canada and Mexico and Guatemala are small fish compared to us. It's not because we're evil. It's because it's the best way to survive in the international system. So number one, you could expect the Chinese to want to maximize their relative power, to grow and build a powerful military.
So, given that lying is such a special category of deception, I figured it made a lot of sense to think about how it applied to international politics. Now, what I discovered is that there are five kinds of international lies. And let me tell you what the five kinds of lies are. The first kinds of lies are interstate lies. Interstate lies are where the leader of one country lies either to the leader of another country or to a foreign audience. And let me give you a good example of that. During the Cold War, the United States was very interested in convincing the Soviet Union that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, were the Soviets to attack into Western Europe. And this is in large part because the threat of nuclear use by the United States was a wonderful way of deterring the Soviets from attacking in the first place. If the Soviets thought that we were going to use nuclear weapons and a conventional war in Europe would therefore likely escalate to the nuclear level, they would never start such a war. So we had a vested interest in convincing the Soviets that we would use those nuclear weapons. Of course, it was not clear that we would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, because if the Soviets were overrunning Western Europe, as bad as that would be, it's nowhere near as bad as a general thermonuclear war that ends up in the United States getting incinerated. So there were all sorts of reasons to think we wouldn't use the nuclear weapons, which of course is why our leaders went to great lengths to say we would use nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara both said when they were in positions of power that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe. Both of them later said that they would have never used nuclear weapons to defend Europe. And when they made those statements, they were bluffing. Bluffing, by the way, is a euphemism for lying. They were bluffing. I think it made eminently good sense for them to bluff because it helped make deterrence work in Europe during the Cold War. But the key point is they are admitting that they were lying. So interstate lying is the first kind of lying. The second kind of lying is fear-mongering. A euphemism for fear-mongering might be threat inflation. Fear-mongering is where a leader lies to his or her own public. It's very different than lying to another country. What the Bush administration did in the run-up to the Iraq War is an example of fear-mongering. The Bush administration understood full well that the American public was not enthusiastic about fighting a war against Iraq. So they felt that what they had to do was make it clearer than the truth, to borrow Dean Acheson's words, that Saddam Hussein was so dangerous that he had to be removed from power. And in the process, they told 4 separate lies. And more generally, they waged a deception campaign. And I, of course, have pointed out a number of those lies already. That's fear-mongering. And there are other examples as well. Lyndon Johnson, some of us in the audience are old enough to remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where Johnson lied about what the North Vietnamese were doing in the Gulf of Tonkin early in August 1964, because he wanted to get a resolution through Congress that basically gave him carte blanche to wage the Vietnam War. That's fear-mongering. A third kind of lying is what I call strategic cover-ups. A good example of a strategic cover-up is President Kennedy lying about the deal that he cut with Nikita Khrushchev to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. What Kennedy was doing was employing a very controversial policy. He made a very important and controversial policy decision that he could not afford to tell the American people and the Europeans about. So he covered it up. He lied. That's what I call a strategic cover-up. It's the third kind of lying. Fourth kind of lying is nationalist myth-making. All states are infected with nationalism. And nationalism invariably involves telling lies about your past. What all countries do is engage in myth-making. They tell stories that portray themselves as the good guys and portray the other as the bad guys. We're all familiar with this process. The example I like to use, because it affected me at one point in time, has to do with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. When I was young, I believed, and virtually everyone I knew believed, that the reason the Palestinians left what became Israel in 1948 was because the Arab leaders told them to leave, because they were then going to come in and murder all the Jews, and then the Palestinians could move back into their homes, and there would be no Jews left because the Arab armies would have finished all of them off. So in effect, it was the Palestinians' own fault for listening to the Arabs and leaving their homes and going outside of mandatory Palestine and creating the problem of all these refugees. We now know, mainly through the work of Israeli historians, that this is not what happened. In fact, there's not a shred of evidence that that's what happened. What happened is that the Israelis ethnically cleansed Palestine. They pushed about 700,000 Palestinians out, and then they would not allow them to return to their homes. This is a nationalist myth. And the United States and all sorts of other countries have similar myths. I'm not picking on Israel here. Israel is not an exception in this regard. But this is nationalist myth-making. Then the final kind of lying, international lying, is liberal lies. We have today around the world a well-established body of norms regarding how to think about war, how to think about when it's permissible to go to war, how to think about what is permissible in the conduct of war, and so forth and so on. And these norms are very closely aligned with basic just war theory. So when states go out and misbehave or act in ways that violate the laws of war, they invariably go to great lengths to try and cover up what they did and portray it in a very different manner. My favorite two liberal lies involve, first of all, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in World War II and British bombing policy in that same conflict. Just with regard to the Wehrmacht, when World War II ended, the United States found itself in a very interesting position. During the war, we were allied with the Soviet Union fighting against Germany. During the Cold War, which followed World War II, we were aligned with Germany fighting against the Soviet Union. We switched partners and we switched adversaries. All of this is to say, we effectively jumped into bed with a lot of people who had been key players in what is probably the most murderous regime in modern history. And because the Germans were so important for creating military power in the center of Europe during the Cold War, we had to clean them up. So we, working in conjunction with the Germans, cooked up the myth that the Wehrmacht, the German military, in particular the German army, had virtually nothing to do with all the murder and mayhem on the Eastern Front in World War II. The Wehrmacht, we argued at the time, and I of course believed this, had clean hands. And it was only the Einsatzgruppe and the special police forces and so forth and so on that were involved in the killing that took place on the Eastern Front. Indeed, that was not true at all. It was a lie. The Wehrmacht was inextricably bound up in the German killing machine on the Eastern Front, and the Wehrmacht did not have clean hands, it had filthy hands. But given that we needed the Wehrmacht, or the remnants of the Wehrmacht, to create the Bundeswehr, we had to tell ourselves and tell others a story that was comprised of lies. And then the other case involves Bomber Harris. In the spring of 1942, the British were desperate, and they thought the only card they had to play against Germany was to use their military, their Air Force, to bomb civilian areas in Germany and kill as many German civilians as possible. But of course, the British did not want to advertise to the world that they were purposely murdering civilians, which of course is what they were doing. They were murdering civilians. It's clearly against the laws of war and international norms to purposely kill civilians. But that's what the British were doing under Bomber Harris. So what did the British do? They lied. They said that they were bombing military targets and they were bombing economic targets. And they were not targeting civilians, when in fact they were targeting civilians. That's a liberal lie. So the 5 kinds of lies I see are interstate lies, where leaders lie to foreign audience, fear-mongering, where leaders lie to their own public to inflate a threat, strategic cover-ups, again, President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, nationalist myth-making, this is countries inventing stories about their founding, for example, to make them look like the good guys and others look like the bad guys, and then liberal lies, which I just talked about. So those are the 5 kinds of lying.
As you know, when the Cold War ended, shortly thereafter, in the Clinton administration, they began to talk about expanding NATO. And as I'll make clear as we go along here, this is one of the principal causes of the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. The first expansion was in 1999, We brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. The second expansion was in 2004. We brought in the Baltic states, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, so forth and so on. And then after 2008, we were talking about bringing in Ukraine and Georgia. Now, when things blew up after the February 22nd, 2014 coup in Ukraine, when things blew up between us and the Russians, they took Crimea, so forth and so on, everybody said the Russians are a threat to overrun Eastern Europe. The whole purpose of NATO expansion was to contain Russia, and thank goodness we were actually moving further and further into Eastern Europe. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. There's no evidence to support that argument. We were moving NATO eastward in large part as an element in a liberal strategy that was designed to take this security community, in the Deutschian sense of the term, that we had created in Western Europe during the Cold War and move it eastward. It included not only spreading NATO, it included spreading the European Union and promoting democracy. You all remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and you remember the Rose Revolution in Georgia? This was all designed to take this security community and move it eastward. Michael McFaul, who I've debated on this issue of the Ukraine crisis, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to right before the 2014 coup, says that I told Putin on numerous occasions, and I told his lieutenants on numerous occasions, that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. And he genuinely believed that. Barack Obama has said the same thing. He genuinely believed it. These people who were pushing NATO expansion did not believe in realpolitik and containment. In fact, they said that anyone who believes in realpolitik and containment, and that includes yours truly, is a 17th century person. That's right. We're dinosaurs. That world has gone away with the end of the Cold War. So NATO expansion was not motivated by realist logic. And by the way, virtually all the realists were opposed to NATO expansion and said, this is not going to have a happy ending. And George Kennan gave a famous interview to Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who wrote it up. And Kennan said exactly that. This is unnecessary and it's going to lead to big trouble. And surprise of surprises, it led to a war in August 2008 between Russia and Georgia. And in 2014, you ended up with a war between Russia and Ukraine over Ukraine. Right? But it was not driven by realist logic. Bush doctrine, a lot of people will say what's going on in the Middle East, or the greater Middle East, is that we are pursuing the American national interest in a realpolitik kind of way, and just disguising our behavior with liberal rhetoric. In fact, if you look at what the Bush administration said, that's not true. And as I explained to you about the Iraq case, we went into Iraq for the purpose of turning it into a liberal democracy, because we saw that as part of a story where there would be no more war in the Middle East. Once we got beyond Iraq and we got Syria involved and Iran involved and we democratized the entire place, it would all lead to peace, love, and dope, and it would take terrorism and nuclear proliferation off the table. That was the basic view here of what we were up to. Of course, it all crashed and burned, but that was the initial intention. And by the way, it was a remarkably ambitious foreign policy. I can think of no case in American history where we pursued a foreign policy that was as ambitious and foolish as this. The idea that we were going to democratize the Middle East, a region of the world that had hardly any history of democracy, at the end of a rifle barrel, is really remarkable. And of course, who opposed that war? Mainly realists. Some liberals did, much to their credit, but mainly realists. Talk a little bit about the Bush doctrine. There are 5 countries that were the main targets of regime change. We actually used military force in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. In the case of Syria, we provided huge amounts of money and training to the rebels. We were deeply committed to overthrowing the government in Damascus, the Assad government. If you read the newspapers in the United States, what you see is people constantly beating Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton over the head for not doing anything to get rid of the regime in Damascus. This is simply wrong. We did not intervene with our own military forces in any meaningful way, but we were behind. We were behind the insurgency in a major way. We were deeply committed to regime change in Syria. And we were also involved in regime change in Egypt. We helped get rid of Mubarak, and then when the Muslim Brotherhood won a democratic election, we helped usher that leader, Mohamed Morsi, out of power when the Egyptian people and the United States became disenchanted with Morsi. But if you just sort of look at those 5 cases, Afghanistan is a disaster zone, Iraq, another disaster zone, Libya, another disaster zone, Syria, another disaster zone. And although we had a brief interregnum where we had liberal democracy or democracy in Egypt, that lasted about a year. And now we're back to where we have a thug in power who we're comfortable supporting, right? This is an abysmal track record. Just think of all the death and destruction in the Middle East since 2001. It's really stunning, really stunning. This is all, in my opinion, this is all due to local factors plus, in a really big way, liberal hegemony. The United States has played a key role in almost all of those cases. Egypt is the only possible exception in causing a huge amount of murder and mayhem, right? Local factors mattered, I don't deny that. But the United States played an enormously important role. Bush Doctrine, why did it fail? Difficulty of doing social engineering. Social engineering in Iraq, social engineering in Afghanistan, good luck. So I think I said in the Q&A period last time, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, virtually all of my colleagues in the national security community were aghast. They said, oh my God, the Soviets are on the march. This is terrible, right? We've been weak in the 1970s, ... My view was exactly the opposite. The Soviets invading Afghanistan was the best news the United States could have had. They just jumped into a giant quagmire. It's like us going into Vietnam. When I used to go to China in the early 2000s, I used to tell the Chinese, what you really want to do is tell the Americans that they have to win the war on terror. You're counting on them to win the war on terror, and they have to stay in Afghanistan and Iraq till they win the war on terror, right? That'll mean forever, right? And meanwhile, you sit on the sidelines and just continue to get richer and richer. The last thing you want to do, if you're China, is end up in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. These are places you want to stay out of for the reasons I said. Difficulty of doing social engineering, nationalism, and the fact that most people, certainly at this point in time, privilege stability over rights. Bottom line, liberal hegemony leads to one failure after another. And this is one of the reasons, ladies and gentlemen, that Donald Trump is President of the United States. He explicitly challenged almost every aspect of liberal hegemony during the 2016 campaign. Almost every aspect. How it all turns out with him, I don't know. But there's a great deal of disenchantment in the body populace in this country. The elites, as I told you, they love liberal hegemony. But the body politic, not so clear. A lot of disenchantment. And I believe that this contributed. I don't think it was the main reason by any means, but I think this contributed to the election of Donald Trump.
Now, the key premise in the book is that lying sometimes makes strategic sense. It sometimes makes good sense for the leaders of a particular country to lie. Lying is a useful tool of statecraft in my argument. Now, in the beginning of the book, I distinguish between selfish lies and strategic lies. Selfish lies are lies that leaders tell that are designed to benefit them. Strategic lies are lies that leaders tell to benefit the country. And let me give you an example that's actually quite controversial that illustrates this division. In the book, I talk about 4 lies that the Bush administration told in the run-up to the Iraq War. And I make the argument that the Bush administration did not tell those lies for selfish reasons. None of the individuals in the administration who lied were going to benefit from those lies personally. They told those lies because they thought it was in the American national interest to go to war against Iraq. As you all know, or as hopefully all of you know, that was a boneheaded decision. But nevertheless, they thought they were doing the right thing. And they waged this deception campaign for what they thought were positive ends. It's also important to emphasize that I talk about noble lies in the book. I make the argument that there are some lies that our leaders have told over time, which I think can be categorized as noble lies. And the best example is the lying that President Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that crisis, Nikita Khrushchev, who was his counterpart on the Soviet side, told Kennedy that he would take the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, provided that Kennedy take the Jupiter missiles, the American Jupiter missiles, out of Turkey. As almost all of you know, Turkey is right next door to the Soviet Union, and those Jupiter missiles looked to the Soviets a lot like the Soviet missiles in Cuba looked like us, and Khrushchev wanted them out. Actually, Kennedy had no problem taking them out, because when he had assumed the office of the presidency in January 1961, he had ordered the Pentagon to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. He didn't want the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, but the Pentagon had failed to take the Jupiter missiles out. So he was, not worried for strategic reasons about those missiles being removed from Turkey. But he felt that if the American public found out about the deal, he would have to renege on the deal. And he also felt that if the Europeans, especially the Turks, found out about the deal, they would think that the United States' commitment to defend Europe was not very firm, and that America was willing to compromise Europe's security to maximize America's security. So Kennedy told Khrushchev, we have a deal, but you cannot announce that we have that deal. And if you do announce that we have that deal, I will deny it. And furthermore, if someone here in the United States smells that a deal has been made and starts asking questions, you want to understand that I'm going to lie about it. Needless to say, a number of journalists and others smelled the deal and started asking questions about whether or not Kennedy had agreed to trade the Jupiters for the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy lied and said there was no such deal. And when I was young, I believed, as did almost everybody else who studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there had been no deal and that Kennedy had stood his ground and insisted that Khrushchev take the missiles out without a quid pro quo. But we were wrong because he had lied to us. I'm glad he lied to us. And I'm glad they cut the deal because it ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the United States came to war during the Cold War. And given that both sides had thermonuclear weapons and there was a chance that a war would have escalated to the nuclear level, I think it was imperative that President Kennedy shut down that crisis. And if he had to tell a lie to the American people and to the Europeans to do it, so be it. So my argument is that there's a distinction between strategic lies and selfish lies. And what I'm talking about tonight is strategic lies. And I'm also making the argument that sometimes those lies turn out to be noble lies. This is not to say that sometimes those lies don't turn out to be blunders. And again, I did reference the Bush administration and its deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War. Now, what exactly do I mean when I'm talking about lying? It's important to get the definitions down. My basic schema looks like this. There's truth-telling on one side, and there's deception on the other side. And underneath deception, there's lying, spinning, and concealment. And I'll walk you through the definitions of all of those. But you want to understand that at the highest level, there's a distinction between truth-telling and deception. Truth-telling is where an individual goes to great lengths to tell a story in a straightforward manner and in as truthful a way as possible. Deception, of course, is the opposite. And among the three kinds of deception, lying usually means saying something that is not true. If Jenna asked me, did I go to Kansas City yesterday? And I said no, when in fact I did go to Kansas City yesterday, that would be a lie. But there's actually another form of lying. And that comes when a person does not make one statement or a series of statements that are untrue, but nevertheless makes a series of statements that are designed to lead the listener to a false conclusion. So you're purposely deploying your statements, and none of those statements by themselves are false. You're purposely deploying those statements to lead the listener to a false conclusion. That's different than actually saying something that you know to be untrue. And let me give you an example for each one of those kinds of lying, again, going to the Bush administration and the run-up to the Iraq War. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said on September 27th, 2002, he said that we have, quote unquote, bulletproof evidence of a link between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Approximately 2 years later, on October 4th, 2004, he told the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, quote, "To my knowledge, I have not seen any strong, hard evidence that links the two." That's a lie. It's a bold-faced lie. An example of the second kind of lying has to do with the argument that the Bush administration made that Saddam was in part responsible for September 11th. When we went to war in March of 2003, well over half of the American people believed that Saddam was in part responsible for September 11th. This was because the Bush administration went to enormous lengths to convince you that that was the case. They never said, however, that Saddam was directly responsible for what happened on September 11th. But they made a series of statements over time that were designed to make you believe that Saddam helped perpetrate September 11th. So those are the two kinds of lying. Then there's concealment and spinning. Concealment is where you simply don't tell the other party about certain facts. And again, to go to the run-up to the Iraq War. And again, to focus on the link between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. We interrogated both Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the principal architect of the attacks, and Abu Zubaydah, and both of them told us in separate engagements that Saddam and Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with each other, and in fact they intensely disliked each other. The Bush administration, not surprisingly, concealed that information from us because the Bush administration wanted to give us the impression that the two of them were joined at the hip. But that's concealment, it's not lying. The third form of deception, which we all engage in our daily lives, is spinning. Spinning is where you don't tell an outright lie, you just arrange the facts in a story to present yourself in a most positive light, or to present an issue that you care about in the most positive light. You leave out the negative parts, or you downplay the negative parts. When a boy and a girl flirt with each other, they engage in spinning. If President Obama were up here and we asked him, what's the state of the American economy? He would engage in spinning. He would tell us all the positive aspects of the economy. He would downplay the negative or conceal the negative aspects. If John Boehner, on the other hand, were up here and we asked him, he'd paint a very different picture, but he too would spin. Neither President Obama nor Mr. Boehner would lie. They would spin. So you have these three forms of deception, and I would argue that we all engage in spinning and concealment frequently. And in fact, there's no way that a society could work without a great deal of spinning and concealment. But lying, on the other hand, is a different matter. If somebody said that one of the real problems with John Mearsheimer is that he's a liar, that would bother me greatly. If all of you thought that I was a liar, that would not sit well with me. If you think that I'm misguided, well, I can live with that. But being called a liar is not something that most people cotton to.
Yeah. This is a great question, and there's just all sorts of issues embedded in it. Right. First of all, he's laying out the preventive war argument, okay? The argument is if John is correct, or there's a reasonably good chance John is correct, then you want to cut them off at the knees now before they grow, okay? And therefore, why not launch a preventive war? And by the way, this is why I think Germany started World War I. I believe Germany is principally responsible for World War I, and it was because they were trying to cut the Russians off at the knees in August 1914. We can't do it, and we can't do it because there's no way we can figure out how to cut the Chinese down to size without precipitating a nuclear war, right? You understand that when the Russians first developed nuclear weapons and when the Chinese first developed nuclear weapons, in both cases, we thought long and hard about a preventive war. And we decided it was just not worth it. And that's where we're at today with regard to preventive war. It just makes no sense, okay? That's point number one. Point number two is China's neighbors, and this is especially true of the Vietnamese and the Philippines, they understand the basic logic that this gentleman laid out. His logic says time is on China's side, right? This is what I always tell the Chinese when I go to Beijing. Don't cause any trouble. Just wait. Wait until you're Godzilla. And then you just come in and you impose the rules. You just say, we're Godzilla. Here are the rules. You either obey them or we crush your skulls. It's just very simple, right? You do not want to pick a fight now because you're not powerful enough. But you see, people in the Philippines and people in Vietnam understand this logic. And the flip side of it is, now is the time, if you're going to settle an issue, to do it. So the Filipinos would like to settle the question of who controls these particular islands or pieces of rock in the South China Sea. You don't want to wait till China is Godzilla. It's that kind of argument. And I believe that if you were to look at all the controversies over the past 5 years between China and its neighbors, that its neighbors precipitated almost every one of those conflicts, right? And in fact, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Shui Tiankai, he made that point in an interview in Foreign Affairs this past summer. I think he's correct. Because the Chinese understand time is on their side. The neighbors understand time is not on their side, right? So they're the ones who've been precipitating the conflicts. The Chinese, in my opinion, have overreacted and in the process scared all their neighbors, plus scared the United States. But that's a different matter. But the basic problem that we face is that it's hard to see how you can slow down Chinese growth to head off this problem at the pass. Yeah, everybody heard that? I'm going to try and make sure I don't lose the microphone when I talk. Just let me take them in reverse order. Missile defense, then nuclear weapons. I think that missile defense is not a serious issue. I can't believe how much money we've spent on missile defense and how people talk about missile defense as a serious way of dealing with threats. I was in the Air Force and I worked in Air Force research and development for 5 years, and I worked on ballistic missiles. I worked on the MX missile. I know a lot about missile warheads. Spent a lot of time dealing with missiles sent from Green River in Utah down to White Sands in New Mexico. We can defeat any missile defense like that. And missile defense is not possible against somebody who has an even semi-sophisticated ballistic missile capability. I just can't believe how missile defense gets trumped into this serious issue. But anyway, nuclear weapons, a different issue. I think if you're going to argue against me, the first place you go is nuclear weapons. So her first argument's the first place to go against me, right? What you really want to do is you want to take the nuclear weapons argument, you want to marry it with the economic interdependence argument, right? We can, and then marry it with the nationalism argument. I won't elaborate on that, but that's how to argue against me. Let's just say a few words about nuclear weapons. First of all, you make the argument that nuclear weapons pretty much make it impossible for China to get really aggressive, especially with the United States. I mean, it's possible that could be a fight over the Senkaku Islands or over Taiwan, but both sides will go to enormous lengths to make sure the war does not escalate because of the threat of nuclear weapons being used. And furthermore, you just can't have a great power war. This is what I told you about the Cold War. Why was Central Europe so stable? Remember what I said about the Central Front. We could not get a war going in Central Europe because it would be World War III with nuclear weapons. So basically, just to take your point, India has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, China has nuclear weapons, the United States has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and Japan might very well have them in due course. So given all those nuclear armed states, everybody is going to be extremely cautious. And there's no chance in that world that the Chinese can push us out or we can do anything to really damage China. So that would be the argument that I would make, and I'd marry it to the economic interdependence argument and the argument that nationalism makes conquest difficult. And that's how I would argue against myself. But I still think I'm right.
Thank you.
Well, my argument would be that as the Chinese economy matures and gets bigger and looks more like the Western economies, it will be able to, create the sort of military might that we have. And even if it doesn't, the fact that, this is a country that has 4 times the population of the United States. Right? One of the counter-arguments to me, by the way, here is that China may become so powerful there's nothing we can do about it, right? If China has a per capita GNP that looks like Taiwan or looks like Hong Kong or looks like South Korea, right, it is going to be so much more powerful than the United States. We've never been up against the state. The Soviet Union probably had at its height about 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. probably about 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. Germany, Japan, especially Japan, not anywhere near as powerful as the United States, even Imperial Germany. We could be facing a situation with China where it is just so powerful that it dominates Asia. It's sort of the story I told you about how we ended up dominating the Western Hemisphere. There was only one country that could stop us. That was Britain. They were too far away, pinned down, worrying about events in Europe and so forth and so on. And that could happen out there. Well, this is to say that even if they're not as good at translating their economic might into military might, as your question implies, they could still build one heck of a lot of military capability, and we're taking them on in their own backyard, 6,000 miles away from the continental United States. From California to China, 6,000 miles. So they're in their backyard. That's a huge power projection problem for us. So Chinese could be very, very powerful. Could you say what the question is?
So could you speak about China's economic dominance or increasing economic dominance in Africa and the U.S.'s corresponding sort of military, it's a small pivot with a small p to Africa?
Yeah. I think that there are three areas of the world that are worth fighting and dying for. One is Europe, two is Northeast Asia, and three is the Persian Gulf, not the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. Europe and Northeast Asia are strategically important. They're core strategic interests, Europe and Northeast Asia, because that's where other great powers are. And the Persian Gulf is of great importance because of oil, okay? I do not believe Africa is a core strategic interest for us or for the Chinese. I think that there's no question that we will compete with the Chinese there, but it will not be that serious. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had a serious contest over three areas: Europe, Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Gulf, right? Not Africa. This is not to say that, you know, in places like Angola we didn't mix it up, but not serious, okay? And I think the same thing will apply to China with regard to Africa. Africa is not that important. The area where we're going to mix it up with them in a serious way is the Gulf, because they are highly dependent and becoming increasingly dependent on oil and gas out of the Gulf. And that is going to have significant consequences for our foreign policy and for the kinds of military forces that we build. And it not only has consequences for building a rapid deployment force or power projection into the Gulf, it also says all sorts of things about the slocks or the sea lines of communication that go from the Gulf through the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, up through the South China Sea. You know the whole story. So it's the Gulf that I would focus on. But if I'm wrong, and it is Africa, that sea lane or sea line of communication argument still applies. I think that the geography of the Cold War was fundamentally different than the geography that will exist in a U.S.-China competition. And I think it is as Eric described it, but I want to embellish the argument. And I want to try and make the point that I think war is more likely between China and the United States than it was during the Cold War, building on what he said. During the Cold War, as he pointed out, the center of gravity in the competition was Central Europe. When we used to run war games, everything in a war between the United States and the Soviet Union got pulled into Europe. It was like a giant magnet, right? The inter-German border. That's where the money was, okay? However, we could never get a war started when we ran war games. And the reason is that a war in Central Europe would have been World War III with nuclear weapons. And World War III with nuclear weapons would have meant we all got vaporized. And nobody wanted to get vaporized. So it was actually a remarkably stable situation in Europe. He points out quite correctly that there is no equivalent. This is the Bob Ross argument as well, of course, that he was referring to. there is no equivalent to the Central Front in Asia. And in fact, when you look at Asia and you say to yourself, where are the potential conflict situations? These are them. 1, North Korea, South Korea. 2, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, right? 3, Taiwan. And 4, the South China Seas, where you have a handful of islands and all sorts of claims about, which part of the water belongs to which country and so forth and so on. These are potential conflict situations that bear no resemblance to the Central Front. And you can hypothesize a situation where you have a war over the Senkaku Islands. That was the point I made to this gentleman before. It is possible that you could have a war over the Senkaku Islands. You could have a war over Korea. Would anybody rule out a war between North Korea and South Korea? And by the way, you remember what happened last time North Korea and South Korea got into a war. The United States got pulled in, the Chinese got pulled in. And for those of you who don't know much about the Korean War, we did not end up fighting North Koreans between 1950 and 1953. It was the United States fighting the Chinese. The United States fighting the Chinese, right? So we could end up in a shooting match over Korea. We could end up in a shooting match over Taiwan. Is it likely? I'm not making that argument. But the point that I'm making to you is, given the geography of a future competition between China and the United States, which, as you point out, is so different than the Cold War, right? I think the potential for conflict is actually significantly greater, which is not to say we will axiomatically have a war. That liberal hegemony undermines liberalism at home. It threatens core American values because America becomes a militarized state. You get this huge national security state. And especially when you're fighting a global war on terror and you think you definitely have to monitor what people in the society are doing. You have to turn the National Security Agency loose to monitor people's emails and telephone conversations and so forth and so on, right? So I think that as founding fathers understood, James Madison in particular, no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And we live in a country that's engaged in continual warfare. And it's engaged in continual warfare because we have decided to pursue a policy of liberal hegemony. And that was not necessary. As Nuno said, when you're in unipolarity, you have 3 choices, 3 very different choices, 3 stark choices. And we decided to do massive social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel. We tried to create a planet that's filled with liberal democracies. And it failed. And that's where we are today. Thank you. As I said to you before, NATO expansion, EU expansion, and spreading democracy were all about enlarging the security community that existed in Western Europe. And there was even thoughts of eventually bringing the Russians in. It was not balance of power politics. But what happened is that after the April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where we said that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO, you had shortly thereafter, in August 2008, a war over Georgia, and then in 2014, you had the war over Ukraine. Remember, 2008, April 2008, look at the communique that was issued after the Bucharest NATO summit. It said that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. And you had wars involving both of those countries. And the Russians have no intention of letting either Georgia or Ukraine become part of the West. They'll wreck both those countries before they let it happen. This is basic geopolitics. And what's happened to Putin? Putin's standing has gone up significantly. Why? Basic nationalism. Nationalism at home. Factors driving the Russian behavior. Realism 101, nationalism, and stability over rights. That's the Russian story. That's why it's so hard to sell liberal democracy in Russia, the last consideration, and why the Ukraine crisis happened, first point. And second point about nationalism is why Putin is so popular.
Did everybody heard the question? His question deals with the tension between investigative journalists on one hand, who are looking to uncover the truth, and leaders who are interested in waging deception campaigns and in some cases telling lies. And he was interested in how I think about that relationship. I think that there is no doubt that journalists are, in principle, committed to finding out what's really going on and reporting it to the American people. And that's why in a number of cases that I looked at in the book, you see presidents and their lieutenants lying to journalists. I tell the story in there about how Jody Powell, who was President Jimmy Carter's principal spokesman, lied to a journalist about the aborted Iran rescue mission. And there are a number of other cases as well. But I would say that what's happened in the United States, and this was clear in the run-up to the Iraq War, is that the mainstream media has basically abandoned its interest in ferreting out the truth and challenging the administration, and instead has become a useful tool for presidents who want to tell lies to the American people. I think one of the principal reasons that we, collectively, were bamboozled by the Bush administration in the run-up to the Iraq War is because the American mainstream media failed to do its job.
Sorry, I'm Nell Smith, class of '85, college. Hey, Julius. See you later. About the Bucharest directly, I have a friend that was teaching in Russia this summer and said that people were just, for those, I speak Russian and been to Soviet Union and then post, I mean, suddenly it's not, you're no longer a rock star now, apparently, if you're American and you're on the streets of Moscow, like we're used to, people my age. She said people were coming up to her saying, "What are you doing? Why you and the Germans have caused all of this? You got all these rebels in Ukraine, you organized them secretly in Kiev." And it was kind of, but now listening to you, it's like, that's actually not that far off, it sounds like. I mean, we didn't organize them, but basically we kind of told them, yeah, go ahead, because we're going to help you, right? Is that,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, let me make a couple points, very important points. With regard to my response to the gentleman who's directly behind you about nationalism, this is Russian nationalism coming to the fore. And a lot of what you see in the American case is American nationalism coming to the fore. You've all heard the famous saying or infamous saying, "My country, right or wrong," right? And there are just all sorts of Russians, who are furious at the West, and they're rallying around Putin. One of the reasons that many people think that Putin started this whole thing was because it so improved his standings in the polls or with the Russian public, because people behaved the way you said. So people said he started this crisis for that reason. But my point to you is we should be hardly surprised. And this gets back to the China-Japan example. And this is a very scary dimension to a lot of these conflicts. But I just want to say one other thing. I've done all the research for a book on the German killing machine in World War II. I know a great deal about who the Germans killed, how they killed them, and so forth and so on. Some of you here have probably taken my course, War on the Nation State, where I talk about the origins of the Holocaust, the origins of the war on the Eastern Front, killing of Soviet POWs, and so forth and so on. But my estimate is that Hitler murdered, this is not killed in combat, Hitler murdered 22 million people. And if you look at how that war played itself out in places like Ukraine, there were people in Ukraine who sided with the Germans, and the vast majority of people, of course, fought against the Germans. But the consequences of that war are inextricably bound up with what's going on now. And the mere fact that there are, some reasonably small number, but nevertheless some fascists, real fascists, involved in Kiev, just spooks the Russians like you would not believe, right? And a lot of those fascists and people on the far right hate the Soviet Union for all the obvious reasons, see the Soviet Union / Russia as largely responsible for all the killings that took place in Ukraine on the part of the Soviet Union, not the Germans, right? War history coming in. So what's going on inside Ukraine is inextricably bound up with World War II. And then the point that I tried to make to you, although I didn't develop it at length, is that NATO, which is a Cold War institution, right, is inextricably bound up with the Cold War. And from a Russian point of view, this military alliance moving up to its doorstep, which was a mortal foe for 45 years, is going to spook you. And if you have a coup in Kiev and some of the people who come to power have fascist tendencies or are fascists, however you want to define that term, it's going to have really huge consequences, right? So this is an incredibly messy situation. And in the context of all this, what we've done is doubled down. And we do not pay much attention to history because it was not a history that concerned us in any meaningful way, because it was on the eastern half of the European continent. But the potential for trouble here is just very, very great.
My basic argument is that in the last decade of the Cold War, it made eminently good sense for the United States to ally itself with China and to help China grow economically, because that would make China more powerful and it would allow China to be a good ally for purposes of balancing against the Soviet Union. But then when the Cold War ended in 1989, the question on the table was, how should the United States think about dealing with China? And the fact is that China was a very poor country in 1989, but it had a huge population advantage over the United States. And therefore, there was a real danger if we helped China grow economically, given its population advantage, if it became rich, if it became prosperous with all those people, it would be a threat to the United States. In effect, it would be a peer competitor. What happened over the course of the 90s, and really the first 20 years of this new century, is that the United States foolishly pursued a policy of engagement which was designed to make China richer, to make it wealthier. Just very important to understand that we helped China, we, the United States, and of course the Australians, the Japanese, and so forth and so on, went along with us. We made China into a powerful country in East Asia. And China is now at a point where it is determined to dominate all of Asia, to become a regional hegemon. The United States, of course, and the Australians are bent on preventing China from dominating Asia for good strategic reasons. But the end result of all this is that we're effectively in a new Cold War. We have an intense security competition on our hands, and this is a very dangerous competition.
Okay, so succinctly summarised, your argument is that once China grew wealthy as a result of Western engagement, particularly US engagement in the 1990s and the 2000s, that a US-China great power competition was inevitable. And had US policymakers understood the realist logic, your logic, John, of great power conflict in the early 1990s, they would have tried to slow down Chinese growth and maximize the power gap between Beijing and Washington. That's your line, right?
That's exactly right, Tom. And the fact is, as you well know,
in the early 1990s, most people thought that realism was dead or that balance of power politics was dead. Great power war was off the table forever, and that people like me were dinosaurs. So when I made the argument loudly and clearly starting in early 2001, that we were in trouble and we should do what we can to slow down China, nobody wanted to hear that argument.
Okay, so instead of fostering harmonious relations between China and the US, as the conventional wisdom said it would in the 1990s and 2000s, all engagement's done is led to this intense security competition. The question here is, what course then should have been conducted, and how would that have changed where we are now?
Well, it's very important to understand that in 1990, China was a backward country economically. It had 1/75th the per capita GNP of the United States. And per capita GNP is a really good indicator of just how wealthy a country is. So this was a backward country, but it was deeply committed to growing economically, to becoming prosperous. So the question is, what should the United States do? A good realist like me would say that it's obvious that what the United States should do is do everything possible to slow down Chinese economic growth. And here we're talking about the fact that China depended on US markets, US technology, and US capability to grow. And with regard to those markets, we should have gone to great lengths to slow down trade with China, to not give them any special deals, which we did do. We certainly should have not welcomed them into the WTO. And as far as technology is concerned, we should have gone to great lengths to prevent technology transfers to China. And we should have gone to great lengths to limit foreign direct investment in China. And we did none of those things. And in fact, we did the opposite.
And the result is we're now in deep trouble, you say, and there is little we can do to change the situation. Tell us more.
Look, the fact is, Tom, from Beijing's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to want to dominate Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese have no interest in having the Americans in their backyard any more than we, the United States, have an interest in having China in our backyard. That's why we have the Monroe Doctrine. So once you take a country with that large a population and you make it really wealthy, it is going to have the wherewithal to take efforts or to take measures to try to dominate its region of the world. And of course, the United States is going to try to prevent that. So what we did was we created a situation where China was powerful enough, or is powerful enough, to try to dominate Asia.
This is the ethnic breakdown of Ukraine. I'm going to show you a number of maps, all of which are designed to show you that Ukraine is a badly divided country, and what's taking place inside Ukraine today is in good part a civil war. And to that extent, it doesn't have that much to do with what the Russians or the West are doing there. And as you can see in red are mostly Ukrainian-speaking people. And then as you move further east, you're talking about lots of Russians and certainly lots of Russian speakers. This is the Ukraine election of 2004. This is the election in the wake of the famous Orange Revolution, which I'll talk more about. As you can see, the country is badly divided between the East and the West. The Russian speakers in the East and the Ukrainian speakers in the West. This is the 2010 election, which resulted in Yanukovych getting elected. I'll talk about President Yanukovych as we go along. He was elected in 2010. And you can see there the voting patterns in the 2010 election look a lot like the voting patterns in the 2004 election. And then these are two recent surveys that came out from the International Republican Institute, that's here in the United States.
This one says, if Ukraine could enter only one international economic union, which of the following should it be? And of course, the blue is the EU, and the light blue is the customs union, or actually the red is the customs union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And the cities up at the top are in Western Ukraine, and the cities down on the bottom are in Eastern Ukraine. So you can see very clearly that people in the West would like to join the EU. People in the East have little interest in joining the EU. Those are the EU numbers. Here are the NATO numbers. I mean, these two charts look virtually the same. But all of this tells you that you have a badly divided country. And the conflict between the West and Russia over Ukraine is played out in the context of this situation. This is a simple little view graph that shows Europe's dependent on Russian gas. It's quite clear from that view graph that many of the countries in Eastern Europe and even countries like Germany are heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. And of course, that gives the Russians lots of political leverage in this crisis, and it makes it very difficult for us to put pressure on the Russians. I think when the Cold War ended in 1989, and the Soviet Union effectively disappeared over the course of the next 2 years, we entered a world where you can say either it was unipolar, which means there was only one great power, the United States, or you could say it's multipolar. Russia and China were also great powers, but they were both so weak that there was no way they could challenge the United States. Whether you think it's unipolar or unbalanced multipolar, the United States was free to roam and free to cause all sorts of trouble. So I like to point out to groups, the United States has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We have fought 6 different wars. We are addicted to war. When you come to Washington, it's like going to a place that is constantly thinking about who the next target is. We almost went to war against Syria. We're talking about going to war against Iran. The principal reason that this is the case is because we have no great power competitor. And if you think about the story that I'm telling you a story where China rises and great power politics, great power versus great power politics come back in a way that they obtained before 1990. Think about 1900 to 1990, Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and then I'm telling you about China down the road. But in between, no great power. So we're free to run around the world remaking it in our own image. And the consequences are not pretty, in my opinion.
Really enjoyed your lecture. I have 2 questions briefly. It's hard to take issue with the goal of a neutral Ukraine, but some years before the crisis broke out, I used to listen to RUI, which was Radio Ukraine International on shortwave, and they were fairly open about the cultural crisis within the country leading back a few years before this. As I look at, say, the former Czechoslovakia, do you see a possibility of 2 neutral states formerly known as Ukraine as non-viable, and if so, why?
Yeah, if you look at what happened in Europe after World War II, Yugoslavia broke up into a series of remnant states. Czechoslovakia, as you pointed out, broke up into a series of remnant states. And the Soviet Union itself broke up into a series of remnant states. And that's because inside of those territorial boundaries, you had different nations that wanted their own states. Serbs, Croats in the case of Yugoslavia, Czechs, Slovaks in the case of Czechoslovakia. And we know that there were probably 15 or 16 different groups inside of the former Soviet Union. So the question is, inside Ukraine, do you have a similar situation between the people in the East and the people in the West? I think if you look at the survey data, it still shows that the clear majority of Ukrainians in both the West and the East want to maintain the integrity of Ukraine. They don't want to split Ukraine in half. I think we should do everything we can to maintain that attitude among the Ukrainian people. My great fear is that as time goes by and the animosity continues to grow, that you may reach a point where there is a lot of sentiment to just break Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine off from each other and end up with two Ukraines. But I don't see that happening now.
Second and final question. As we look at parts of our recent additions to NATO, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and look at where their political systems are careening, has NATO lost the moral imperative for its reason to being?
Well, I mean, what we tried to do with NATO expansion and with EU expansion and with democracy promotion was to turn all of Europe into one giant security community in which all of the member states were liberal democracies that were hooked on capitalism and deeply embedded in these institutions and would therefore obey the rules that define the institution, and we would all live happily ever after. That was the goal. And I think everybody understood that Western Europe looked terrific on all of those dimensions. And what we were going to try and do is extend these institutions eastward and consolidate democracy in countries like Hungary and Poland, and we were going to make them look more like Western Europe over time. We had some success, and there's some failures. And if you talk to most people who study Europe today and spend lots of time over there, they're quite pessimistic about where Europe is headed, not only regarding Eastern Europe, but also with regard to Western Europe. And I'm not sure in 25 years what it'll all look like. I mean, in my opinion, the biggest issue is demographic, and that is that Europeans have not been making lots of babies for a long time, and as a result, they're going to have to import lots of people. And these are countries that do not have a rich history of integrating people in a smooth way, much the way the United States does. And it's no accident, I think, that you're now beginning to see the rise of far-right parties all across Europe because of all of the immigration. So one could paint a pretty bleak picture about Europe's future. But the counter to that would be, we've now got all those countries, like Romania, right, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, embedded in these institutions. And these institutions will go to great lengths to combat those tendencies and in maybe a more incremental way, facilitate the spread of liberal democracy and capitalism. We'll see whether that happens or not. But people today are nowhere near as optimistic as they were in the early 1990s, when it looked like we had the wind at our back and everything was going to play out over time in favor of the West, and especially in favor of the United States. You all remember Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of History, right, which I think reflected that optimism when the Soviet Union was losing the Cold War and about to collapse. But times have changed.
Of journalism. Just recently, you're aware of the WikiLeaks, I guess, phenomenon that has been occurring the past couple of months. Obviously, they're undermining some of the lies that that nations have told, whether they be strategic or selfish lies. So I was just wondering how you regarded that sort of investigative journalism, if you selectively supported it or if you were against it.
Okay. With regard to WikiLeaks, it's not an example of investigative journalism. There was this man, Bradley Manning, who was a soldier in the Army, who gave all of this data to Julian Assange, and he then made it available to a handful of newspapers. And the newspapers have published those documents, but this is not investigative journalism. As I said, the mainstream media doesn't do much investigative journalism anymore. The American mainstream media is basically toothless. You young people in the audience can't appreciate it because you don't remember when the American mainstream media actually had some bite. But I can assure you it's toothless now, and presidents manipulate it with great ease. With regard to WikiLeaks, I think that what you see, if you look at the documents that have been released so far, is number one, there's not much evidence of lying. There is some, for sure, and much of the lying is leaders lying to their own public, not lying to each other. And the best example of this is the head of Yemen, who was in cahoots with the Americans, in particular with General Petraeus, to allow us to use the American Air Force to strike at al-Qaeda targets in Yemen. But the president of Yemen said, you can do that to General Petraeus, but you have to understand that I have to tell my people that it is the Yemenese Air Force that's doing the attacking, not the American Air Force, because it would get me into an immense amount of trouble on the home front, right? And I am very interested, he had a vested interest in dealing with al-Qaeda, right? So he had a good strategic reason for wanting to deal with al-Qaeda. He couldn't do it himself. He was willing to let the Americans do it, but he had to be able to tell his people that it was not the Americans, it was his military, their military that was doing it. This is a strategic cover-up, by the way. The president of Yemen's cover was blown by the WikiLeaks documents. And one of the reasons that he's in so much trouble today and in danger of going overboard, being thrown overboard, is because of WikiLeaks. So WikiLeaks has had a big influence. Thank you. Now, I want to make two sets of comments in conclusion. First of all, I have basically argued up to now that there are real virtues to telling lies, selective lies in international politics. I've even made the case that it sometimes makes sense for leaders to lie to their own people. However, it is important to understand that there is a real downside to lying. And I think that's especially true when you talk about fear-mongering. Not so much interstate lies, but fear-mongering. And let me tell you what the two real dangers associated with lying are, and then let me talk about how each of those dangers relates to fear-mongering. The two dangers are what I call blowback and backfiring. Now, what exactly is blowback? Blowback is where a leader who lies to his or her public about foreign policy soon finds him or herself lying about domestic politics and fostering what I would call a culture of dishonesty. If a leader feels compelled to lie to the public about a foreign policy threat, what that leader is in effect saying is that the public can't deal with the issue by being told the truth. There's just something wrong with the public. It's either not sophisticated enough, it's too ignorant, or it doesn't care. It could be any one of these reasons. But the public, right, has to be manipulated to do the right thing. That's what fear-mongering is really all about. As you surely understand, it's not a giant leap to go from making that kind of calculation about foreign policy to making the same calculation about domestic policy and lying to your public on both fronts. And that fosters a culture of dishonesty, in my opinion, and it is very dangerous because there's no way that a society can function well if dishonesty is rampant. So that's blowback. The other downside to international lying is backfiring. And fear-mongering is a case where backfiring is likely to happen. Backfiring is where the lie doesn't work the way you intended it to work, or the policy that the lie helps create doesn't work. And look at what happened with the Bush administration. The Bush administration waged a deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War. They were successful at bamboozling large chunks of the American people. They got their war, but the war was a disaster. What that tells me is that the reason they couldn't tell us the truth, the reason they had to wage a deception campaign was because their ideas about Iraq were wrong-headed to begin with. If they had told us the truth, we wouldn't have had a war, and we wouldn't have had this disaster. The reason they had to lie, the reason that they had to wage a deception campaign in the run-up to the Iraq War was because they were pursuing a boneheaded policy. The fact that they couldn't tell us the truth and get us to go along was evidence that the policy was wrong-headed. Same thing is true with Lyndon Johnson in the run-up to the Vietnam War, with regard to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in particular. The reason President Johnson had to distort the truth was because if he didn't do that, he wouldn't have gotten permission to wage the Vietnam War. And of course, the Vietnam War was an even greater disaster than the Iraq War. So in both cases, although President Johnson and company and President Bush and company told lies to the American people for what they thought were good strategic reasons, and they were successful at getting us into those two wars, it in the end backfired, and we ended up in disastrous wars. So you see that fear-mongering is a very dangerous way of doing business because it can blow back into the body politic and poison the culture, and furthermore, it can lead to policies that ultimately fail. Finally, let me just say in conclusion that the countries that fearmonger the most are democracies that wage preventive wars against distant threats. Again, the countries in which leaders lie to their publics most often about foreign threats are countries that are democracies that wage preventive wars against distant threats. That, in a nutshell, is the United States of America. Given that the United States seems committed to trying to run the world, given that the United States is a democracy, given that the United States seems committed to using military force liberally, just think about Libya, it seems that we should expect to have lots more evidence of fear-mongering in the years ahead. And therefore, it will probably be the case that when I come back here in 20 years to talk about the new edition of my book, I will reference Eric Alterman's second volume on presidential lying. Thank you.
You've talked about this from the point of view of logical international relations. what do you think of the internal pressures on these countries? Putin has a historically restive population, highly nationalistic, and in major economic troubles now, he may be responding to pressure from his own population to deal with this. On a smaller scale, we see Netanyahu responding to his population, settlers and so on, and disrupting part of the Middle East. Do you see that happening here with the radical right, say, and the neocons influencing Washington policy?
I think just with regard to the United States and the neoconservatives, I think the neoconservatives have been one of the principal driving forces behind America's foolish foreign policy since 2001. But as I said before when I was talking about the Republican Party looking like the Democratic Party, there's not a lot of difference between the neoconservatives and the liberal imperialists. The liberal imperialists are the aggressively oriented Democrats, and the neoconservatives are the aggressively oriented Republicans. But they look a lot like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So the neoconservatives matter for sure, and they mattered during the George W. Bush administration because he was a Republican president. But it's not just the neoconservatives, right? And the fact is that you have a foreign policy establishment here that is interested in intervening all over the world. You have a foreign policy establishment that's filled with people who believe that we have a right and a responsibility to intervene all over the planet. And that leads to unending trouble when you don't have the magic formula for winning the wars that you get into. See, the problem that we have is we have this interventionist foreign policy that leads to us losing all the time. It's really quite remarkable. But just with regard to your point about ideology, I think you do not want to underestimate how important nationalism is, both in the Chinese context and in the Russian context. You were alluding to the Russian case, but let me just say a few words about the Chinese case. And this is why, getting back to this gentleman's previous question, I worry so much now about Japan and China getting into a shooting war over the rocks in the East China Sea. The problem that the Chinese face is that communism, which is the governing ideology, no longer has much legitimacy. And they've had to find a substitute ideology. And by almost all accounts, the substitute ideology is nationalism. Right? And at the core of Chinese nationalism is what's known as the century of national humiliation. Chinese nationalism emphasizes that between roughly 1850 and 1950, that 100-year period, China was humiliated. And it was humiliated by the European great powers, the United States with the open door policy, and especially by Japan. And the Chinese are really just angry about this. And because nationalism is so important for legitimizing the rulers in Beijing, right, this whole theme of national humiliation is front and center. Well, if you have a crisis over some islands in the East China Sea, and that crisis involves Japan mainly, but also the United States, and you're talking about the two countries that have humiliated China during that 100-year period, the potential for trouble is great. And I know a number of scholars in China who are quite dovish, who really worry about a crisis in the East China Sea spinning out of control because of the confluence of Chinese nationalism and Japanese nationalism, which I've not talked about. So nationalism is a very powerful force, not just in the Russian case, but in the Chinese/Japanese case as well.
So, when you discussed the concept of a noble lie, you alluded to JFK lying about exchanging the Jupiter missiles for the missiles in Cuba. But of course, had the journalists discovered that JFK had been lying to him when he said there was no deal, there would have been a massive scandal, it would have undermined faith in government, it would have been a political nightmare. And so my question is...
And Khrushchev might not have taken the missiles out of Cuba.
Indeed. So my question is the criteria for a noble lie its intention, which was obviously very good by JFK, the success of the lie, or both?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Well, in terms of intentions, my argument is that all of these strategic lies have noble intentions. I think that when I talk about a noble lie, I'm talking about a lie that solved a truly important problem. It dealt with an existential threat, and it worked. I'm thinking as I'm answering your question, because your question's an excellent one, and I really hadn't given it a lot of thought. But some people say to me, okay, John, you told us that President Kennedy's lying about the Cuban Missile Crisis is an example of a noble lie. Tell us another example. And the one I go to is President Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, lying about the Greer incident in August of 1941. Just to tell you the story, President Roosevelt was deeply committed to getting us into World War II in 1941. And President Roosevelt was dealing with isolationist America. And he really could not get the United States off dead center. And you want to remember, up until June 22nd, 1941, June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Germany and the Soviet Union were allies, and Britain was basically fighting all alone against Nazi Germany, which was allied with the Soviet Union. So up until June 41, but of course even after June 41, Roosevelt is scrambling like crazy to see if he can get the Americans, if not into the war, at least helping Britain in a really major league way for all the obvious reasons. Anyway, there's a naval incident that takes place in the Atlantic Ocean off the American coast in August 1941, involving a German submarine, a British aircraft, and an American surface ship. And Roosevelt tells a series of lies to the American people. Eric Alterman talks about this in his book. He tells a series of lies to the American people about that incident that are designed to make it look like the Germans are responsible for the incident and they are threatening the United States. And what he's trying to do is get us into the war. Now, I refer to that as a noble lie because I think it was absolutely imperative that we get into World War II against Nazi Germany, and to a lesser extent against Japan. Some of the people in the audience have heard me talk about how I believe Roosevelt engineered us into the war by, in effect, pushing the Japanese to attack us in December 1941. The Japanese were trying to get off the hook. They had no interest in going to war with the United States, and I believe Roosevelt pushed the Japanese to attack us. And I believe he was right to do that because it was imperative that we get into the war. So if you think like I do, I'm not saying you have to agree with me on the importance of getting into World War II, but if you think like I do that it was imperative to get into World War II, right, then lying about the Greer incident can be categorized as a noble lie. But the fact is, it failed. It didn't work. The American people hardly moved an inch on the issue of involvement in World War II. So one could argue if your criterion is success on an important issue, this is certainly an important issue, but he didn't succeed, then it's not a noble lie. If you're looking at just intentions, I think it was a noble lie.
Okay. You said, quote, we're going to have our hands full with China. And so just two questions. What kind of a time frame are you thinking things might start to really happen in that direction? And can you just paint a few scenarios of the sort of things that you think might happen when we have our hands full with China, so we know what we can look forward to?
Yeah, yeah. I think when you think about China at this point in time, there are three situations that stand out. One is Taiwan. Two is the South China Sea, which has been in the newspaper a great deal over the past few months. Chinese basically claim that they control all the South China Sea, and as you know, they're building airfields on reefs in the Spratly Islands, and we've told them that's unacceptable, and their neighbors, the Vietnamese, the Philippines, think that's unacceptable. So the South China Sea is a potential flashpoint. Taiwan is a second flashpoint. And the third flashpoint, which was in the news earlier this year and for much of 2013 and 2014, are those rocks in the East China Sea. The Japanese call them the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diao Islands. As I was saying to you folks before, I was in Japan in December of last year, December 2014. And it's really quite amazing how worried the Japanese are about China. And part of it is sort of for realpolitik reasons, but it's also because the Chinese say those islands, which the Japanese consider to be sacred territory, really belong to China. And the Japanese are greatly fearful that as China gets more powerful, it'll take those islands. So those are the three main flashpoints at the time. There are other possible scenarios that we worry about. The Korean Peninsula is one, because the Chinese are allied with the North Koreans. We're allied with the South Koreans. China and India, they have a border conflict. So we go on and on. But those are the big three. Now, your question about the time frame is an excellent one. I used to say that it'll take another 10, 15 years before China becomes powerful enough for this problem to manifest itself. I'm not sure about that. I think it's possible. It's not likely. I'm choosing my words carefully. I think it's possible that you could have a conflict involving the United States and China over the South China Sea or over the Senkaku/Diao Islands in the next year or so. I mean, those problems are on the front burner, and it's basically a zero-sum game. I mean, either the Chinese own the Senkaku-Diao Islands or the Japanese do. So we could have trouble out there much sooner than I have anticipated up to now.
And say to people, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you ought to do is encourage them to invade a couple countries in Eastern Europe. Let's see how that works out. Not very well. Or if you don't like that, you can have them invade Afghanistan again. They can go in and take over for us, right? I think the Russians understand this, that expansion, this is the power of nationalism. You know, I've made the argument on a number of occasions, the two principal blocks against military aggression today are, number one, nuclear weapons, and number two, nationalism. Nationalism makes it very hard to conquer countries, especially if you have to occupy them. And I think the Russians fully understand this. I'll just say one final point on this. Russia's a declining great power, largely for demographic reasons, but also for economic reasons. Just look at the projected demographic curves out to 2050. There's big trouble on the horizon.